The America's Democrats podcast, a project of 21st Century Democrats, is made possible by contributions from our listeners. Want to do more? Go to americasdemocrats.org and click Donate. And thank you for allowing us to be your voice. And if you enjoy the show, please share it with your friends on Facebook and Twitter, and leave us a review on your favorite podcast app. This is the America's Democrats podcast, the weekly podcast for stand-up Democrats. Had enough of Fox News, the House Freedom Caucus, and Donald Trump? If you want the facts that you won't get from them or from the fake news sites of the alt-right, then stay tuned. Our sponsor, 21st Century Democrats, works hard to get everyday Democrats involved in returning our party to its roots and to success at the ballot box. Sit back and listen, then stand up and fight. And follow 21st Century Democrats on Facebook for all the latest progressive news. We're glad you can join us. And we say hello to Joe Uehlein, founding president of the Labor Network for Sustainability. Joe Uehlein, thanks so much for joining us today on the America's Democrats podcast.
My pleasure. Thanks for having me.
Certainly our pleasure to have you with us. Your organization has embarked on a project called the Just Transition Listening Project, and we're going to talk more about that in a moment. To start off, what is your working definition of just transition?
Well, it's a set of policies that ensures that no worker and no community will be damaged by the transition to a better world, whether that's a transition to renewable energy or a better agricultural system or any of the things that climate change is forcing on us. No worker, no community should bear the brunt of something which is happening through no fault of their own.
Now, let's talk about the Just Transition Listening Project in general. When did you launch it, and who did you listen to?
Well, we launched it, we began the interviews a year and a half or so ago, and we've done well over 100 interviews of both workers and community people in all across the country in all kinds of different industries. So it's been a very broad survey of people's experiences and opinions when it comes to just transition.
This sounds, and it is, a remarkable investment of time. Why did you decide it was important to do?
Well, for starters, there was a difference of opinion within the labor movement, for example, about just transition. Labor has resisted that concept for many, many years. And so we thought that the best way to approach this would be to gather as much personal firsthand data that we could.
In April, you released a report summarizing what you learned from the interviews, and you boiled it down to three themes. The first theme is go big. What does that mean in the context of a just transition?
Well, what it means is we have to go way beyond there's a patchwork of federal programs in place now that aren't really just transition, but they've been used by workers. The most well-known one would be the Trade Adjustment Assistance Program, the TAA, they referred to it, which most working people viewed as a failure because it took so long for the first worker to even qualify, or so many hurdles. So we've got to go big means go beyond that we need a federal program that is robust and well-funded to provide people with not just, training for a different job that may or may not exist, but that has income maintenance. In other words, 5 years, whatever the job you lost paid, you have a 5-year bridge of that income with healthcare, with pension. And for the training, it could be also education. If this worker wants to go to Harvard University and study archaeology, that's fine. That's up to them for what they want to do with their life. If they want to get into a electrician's training program with an apprenticeship, that's awesome too. So to make sure that it's, well, as I said, a robust just transition program, that's go big.
We're speaking to Joe Uehlein, founding president of the Labor Network for Sustainability, and talking about the Just Transition Listening Project. Another theme is go wide. What would this entail, and why is it necessary?
Yeah. Go wide means go beyond a lot of the conversations that we hear today, and they're all great and needed, but they tend to focus on coal and Appalachia. So what we're saying is, well, what about the oil refinery workers in California? What about, and point to a whole host of railroad workers that are that if there's no coal, then the railroad workers who haul coal lose their jobs. I mean, there's a lot of other jobs in the mix here. So that's what we're trying to get to there.
The systemic effects of one particular job are much greater than just the job itself.
Right.
Yeah, yeah. And finally, you recommend that we go far. And this one is about thinking past our immediate needs. What's at stake if we focus too much on that short-term vision?
Well, in part, it's building off the previous question and what I just said. But what would be at risk is if we only focus on a particular community like Appalachia or a particular set of workers, then we risk offending a whole broader set, and we have to go into other industries. If we look at the impacts of climate change on work and working people, which we have done, it's one of the things we do at LNS, there's hardly any group of workers that will be free of impact. And we can talk more about that if you want, but it means covering the broad economy.
So, I mean, obviously this work that you've done is fantastic. What is your hope on how it will get used, and what's next in the mission to further address just transition? Because this is pretty big. This is something that's probably going to need a lot of different people from a lot of different avenues participating.
Yeah, it is, and it's going to take some time. I mean, we had hoped that with a new Biden administration, that by now we'd be well on our way to enacting just transition legislation. And there is a White House task force that is tasked with coming up with just transition proposals. But what we've just seen with the infrastructure and the Build Back Better on the Hill, there's no guarantee anything's going to happen. So we may be looking at a longer term sort of application. And our hope is that the recommendations in this report, the testimonies in this report, will be read by advocates, both in the labor movement and the climate justice movement, but also politicians at all levels. That's our hope. So as we roll it out, that's who we'll be reaching for.
Obviously, as you well know, we as a country have been divided by politics, legislation not getting done. And if it does, it's very little at a time.
Yeah.
This seems very bipartisan to me, though. This affects everybody. It seems to me that you would be able to garner that support you need to advance some of this, if not all of it.
Yeah, I think we could if we had a better representation in the U.S. Congress, because right now one senator, and the one happens to be a coal baron from I don't know, Joe Manchin. You know, that's his industry. So the senator from coal can hold anything up because things are so tight, and it's tight in the House too. So we've got to elect progressive Democrats at all levels to sort of make the calculus work for us in terms of passing real just transition legislation.
Joe Uehlein, founding president of the Labor Network for Sustainability, joining us today on the America's Democrats podcast. We've been talking about the Just Transition Listening Project. Joe, fantastic work that you all are doing. Please keep it up, and we'd love to have you back and talk about it more again down the road.
Great. Thank you very much. I look forward to it.
Thank you. And this is the America's Democrats podcast, the weekly podcast for stand-up Democrats. We want you to sit back and listen to this americasdemocrats.org podcast, a project of 21st Century Democrats. But we need you to stand up and fight. Do you want to get involved and help get our party back to its roots and to success at the ballot box? You can make your contribution to help us keep this show going and to elect Democrats who will stand up for democratic principles. Go to americasdemocrats.org and click on Donate at the top of the page.
Our society has coined expressions like philanthropist to encourage and hail people's charitable spirit. Look on the flip side of that shiny coin of generosity, however, and you'll find that its base substance is societal selfishness. After all, the need for charity only exists because we're tolerating intentional injustices and widespread inequality created by power elites. A society as supremely wealthy as ours ought not be relegating needy families and essential components of the common good to the whims of a few rich philanthropists. Yes, corporate and individual donations can help at the margins, but they don't fix anything. Thus, food banks, health clinics, etc. must constantly scrounge for more charity, while big donors have their charitable spirit subsidized with tax breaks that siphon money from our public treasury. Especially offensive to me is the common grandiose assertion by fat cat donors that charity is their way of, quote, giving back to society. Hello? If they can give so much, it's probably because they've been taking too much. As business columnist Andrew Ross Sorkin points out, all too often, charitable gifts are used to make up for the failure of companies to pay people a living wage and treat their workers with dignity. It's not just the unemployed who rely on food banks, but janitors, nannies, Uber drivers, checkout clerks, and others who work full-time but are so poorly paid they can't make ends meet. That's not a sad charity case, but a matter of criminal exploitation by wealthy elites. And the charitable thing to do is to outlaw it and require a living wage for all. This is Jim Hightower saying, as Sorkin puts it, the aim should be to create a society where we don't need places like food banks. We should be trying to put the food banks out of business.
If you'd like more of Jim Hightower's real populism, check out the Hightower Lowdown. Jim's monthly newsletter gives you the real lowdown on which corporations, by name, are doing what to the middle class, our environment, and our democracy. Each month, the Hightower Lowdown brings you facts you didn't know, along with actions you can take to fight back. It also comes with a sense of humor. Hightower believes we can fight the gods and still have fun. Plus, get this, it's cheap. Only $15 brings you 12 issues a year. For real populism, go to hightowerlowdown.org.
This Social Security measure, I believe that we must pass legislation to provide medical care.
This is our tradition. When our grandparents came to America, it was the Democratic Party which said, welcome. It was the Democratic Party, the party of Roosevelt and Truman and Kennedy and others, who said that America belonged to all its people, not just a handful of the rich or a few giant corporations. That's why great leaders like FDR fought so hard for Social Security, and why JFK stood up to the insurance companies and their Republican allies to get Medicare. It's not just one thing, or one time, in one place. It's about a whole history of standing up to the Republicans and saying someone has to be on the side of regular working people in America, whether it's defending Social Security or just the way your loved ones are treated on the job. That's what the Democratic Party is all about. And that's why this message has been brought to you by the Democratic Party. Working people like you and me.
Paid for by 21st Century Democrats. Not authorized by any candidate or candidates committee.
Someone asked me, why would you run for chair of the Democratic Party of Wisconsin? And I said, it's because these Republicans are out of control. And they said, if you're elected state party chair, Republicans will be the least of your problems.
Well, you're doing a great job out there, and it's really good to be able to talk to you. Let me start with Ron John. I've got to ask. I mean, look, this guy was always a conservative, but he was never this crazy. What happened?
He has changed. I feel like I don't know if it's the filter coming off completely, or if it's the effect of watching Trump. I think a lot of it has to do with watching Trump, because there's the very publicized way that he's gone way off the deep end, calling climate change BS and opposing pushing of vaccines and all these really offensive things, totally whitewashing January 6th. But there's another side to it, which is that since Trump came into office, he's gone into overdrive with the most self-serving policies. He literally refused to vote for Trump's giant tax giveaway to the ultra-rich until he could add a special tax break for the kind of corporation that he personally owns. So he won't say how much money he personally made, but we know his biggest campaign donors, a couple of Wisconsin billionaires who put $20 million into his 2016 election, walked away with more than $200 million the next year alone.
Wow. But
it is the most, it's ATM politics. It's disgusting.
But, and as you point out, like on COVID, right? He's not only an anti-vaccine person, he pushes these other things like mouthwash, like really?
Standard gargle mouthwash, he says, kills COVID. Listerine had to weigh in and give a correction in saying that its product does not prevent COVID infections. But I think he's playing. I think part of this is, it's hard to believe anyone believes this stuff, but part of it is a strategy to try to appeal to the most extreme fringe, and it gets him publicity and it pisses off people like us, which then for people who love seeing liberals get annoyed, it's delightful for them. But at the same time, he is using the power that all of this gives him to pad his own pockets. And that's one of the things we found, is that for voters who, even Republican voters who backed him in the past, as well as certainly independent voters, the self-serving nature of what he does is a giant, it's a voter repellent. The more people learn about it, the less support he has going into 2022. And we want to make that a key part of what people learn about Ron Johnson.
And of course, as this coming into office, he said, I'll be there just 2 terms, right? I don't want to be one of these people that die in office and drag it out. And now he is reneged on that promise. Does anybody care?
For people that love having him in office, they don't care. For the rest of us, it's the least reason to oppose him. But it does it does kind of illustrate the way that he always makes decisions based on what's best for Ron Johnson rather than what's best for the public. It wasn't just that he said he wouldn't want to serve more than 2 terms. It's that he had a principled argument against it, which is that you needed citizen legislators. That was the basis of his self-term limit. He's now a creature of Washington. I mean, he's a kind of a poster boy for what's happened to the worst parts of the Republican Party nationally, and breaking his own term limit pledge is just part and parcel of all that.
And then he says, I love this statement. He's changing his mind. He changed his mind because America needs him, right? Like the people of America are crying out, please, Ron, don't go away.
I know. I mean, the funny thing is that if he paid even the most minimal attention to what the general public wants, as opposed to his kind of mega donor base wants, he would see that people do not want him in the Senate. They don't want him in public life. The guy should be off the stage. He has worn out his welcome. But again, for a very small group of people, it's been incredibly lucrative to have him in the Senate, and they're getting great donor service. And who could ask for something better than a 10-to-1 return in a single year on their campaign contributions? So I'm sure there are a handful of people who definitely want him to run, and I think those are the people whose side he's on.
I saw that a couple of days ago, the Capital Times, which is out of Madison, I believe, the newspaper there, called Johnson himself the virus that is infecting the Republican Party, and called him a delusional huckster. Well described, I believe. Does that reflect what the rest of the state's media is saying about him?
I mean, it's mixed. Wisconsin has 81 right-wing talk radio stations, and he loves going on right-wing talk radio. And he, it's the place where he's done his most impressively awful work in a lot of ways. So for right-wing talk radio, for Fox News, where he went right after he announced in the pages of the Wall Street Journal editorial page, where he actually made his announcement, in those places, he's being celebrated. I think the general public who get their news from non-biased sources see how bad he's been. But I will also say that for a lot of voters, so much attention has been paid to what is offensive about what he stands for. And there's been much less attention to how he's used his power to benefit himself. And part of my lesson from 2016 is that if people knew how much Trump broke all his promises and stiffed regular people, and how much he was a con man and not just someone saying offensive, outrageous things, I think that election might have gone differently. So we don't want to make that same mistake with Ron Johnson. We want to make sure we talk about what affects people, not just what offends people.
Will there be a GOP primary challenge to him, do you believe, or is there?
Extremely unlikely, in my view. Johnson has really kind of cornered the market on extreme fringe positions. So it's not like you can run to his right. And there's not a lot of energy left in the vital center of the Republican Party, but used to be the mainstream of the Republican Party. So I think he's going to run unchallenged until the general. Now, the fact that he's so repelled so many voters that he only has a 35% approval rating in Wisconsin has attracted a dozen Democrats to run against him. And that's, I think, a real sign of his weakness, that so many people look at him and think, not only would I be a better senator, but I could beat this guy in a general election. And our primary is not till August 9th. So it's a very late primary. The party's required by our Constitution to be neutral in the primary. So my focus every day, and the focus of thousands of volunteers around the state, is to make sure we've done everything we can do with organizing, with building local volunteer teams, with voter protection work, to be ready for the moment when we have a nominee, and then shoot like a rocket ship through the November election day.
At this point, is there any front runner? As you say, I know from your position as state chair, you can't take sides in the primary, but any two or three front runners?
I mean, listeners can Google to learn about the different candidates, but as state chair, it really is my job to be thinking about how to make sure that whoever the nominee becomes can roar through the finish line. We have some experience with this. We had a 16-way primary to run against Scott Walker in 2018, and we had 26 people running against Donald Trump in 2020. So in each case, the state party built a statewide campaign infrastructure so that once we had a nominee, they started ahead instead of having to start from scratch.
By the way, I want to get back to this Johnson contest, but whatever happened to Scott Walker, by the way? Someone asked me that this morning, and I said, you know what? I haven't heard of him in years. Is he still active? Is he still around?
So Scott Walker runs Young Americans for Freedom, which is, I don't know if you could really say that he's for freedom. He's 54 years now.
He's not young either. Right?
Not exactly. Young. Yeah, he's not I mean, maybe this counts for young in the ranks of Republican politicians, but he's, he has a special interest group that he's advocating with now, and he's kind of trolling people on Twitter. But he's really off the stage. And it's interesting because, he, Reince Priebus, who was the Republican Party chair in our state before he became the National Party chair who elected Trump, right? Paul Ryan. It used to be those three were the kind of dominant figures in Republican politics in Wisconsin, and all of them are off the picture now. Interesting.
Yeah. So back to Johnson. You do believe that he is vulnerable in November?
He's deeply vulnerable. The polling suggests that he's the most vulnerable incumbent senator from either party.
Whoa.
He's has, I think 6 percentage point more Wisconsinites disapprove of the job he's doing than approve. There's a big group of people that just do not want him to get another term. Now, the group I'm worried about is the 22% of Wisconsinites who tell pollsters they don't have an opinion yet. And so our goal is to make sure that those people get enough information to reach an opinion. That number used to be 30%, and we've driven it down by about a quarter over the last year. We just have to keep chipping away and make sure people actually, when people hear the name Ron Johnson, something comes to mind, as opposed to having a blank slate. Because what he did in the past, he kept a kind of a low profile for his first term.
Right.
When he ran for re-election, his re-election campaign was that he was a common sense, no BS businessman, and that's what people voted for. Also, who was not going to run for another term, and that's what people voted for. And then he turned around and gave himself a giant tax cut and started, saying things that embarrassed our state.
What are the registration numbers in Wisconsin?
So Wisconsin doesn't have partisan voter registration. So, we have our models and so forth, but there's no moment in the registration process where people say, I'm a Democrat or I'm a Republican. The other thing is we have same day registration. So typically, 6 to 12% of the entire electorate registers and votes at the same time, either during the 2 weeks of early voting or on election day itself. And that means that you have to interact with everyone you talk to as a potential voter, whether they're registered or not. But it also means you often don't know who's going to be a registered voter until after the polls have closed.
So that gets to the question of turnout, right? And that gets to the question of enthusiasm and energy. Do you sense that now on the ground in Wisconsin? I mean, Wisconsin is such a key state. It seems that every 4 years, right, it's all about Wisconsin.
So Wisconsin's the only state in the country that's had 4 out of the last 6 presidential races come down to less than 1 percentage point.
Wow. Huh. Biden the last time, and then Trump before that.
Yep. And John Kerry in 2004 and Al Gore in 2000. Obama won in a landslide, but each time he won, he was followed by a Scott Walker win in a landslide. So, either we're on a knife's edge or we're zigzagging. And I think this election cycle is likely to be no exception. We can see there's lots of publicity about Republican energy. On the Democratic side, we organize a big kind of day of canvassing and making phone calls 1 year out from election day, every election cycle. In 2021, we set a goal that was more than twice as high as the goal that we'd set in 2019 before the presidential election, and we crushed that goal. We have
kidding. Yeah.
We had more volunteer shifts in our spring statewide election in 2021 than we did in the spring of 2020 in the state Supreme Court election after COVID hit. So there really is a ton of energy on the Democratic side, and we're going to need every bit of it because the deck is always stacked against you in midterm elections when your party controls the presidency. So I really see this as another 1 percentage point, Wisconsin knife's edge election, and it's going to be intense. But we need every minute Wisconsinites and friends of Wisconsin can put in to make sure every voter knows the stakes.
But you're saying that you see that and you can measure that enthusiasm based on your big event in 2021 for the midterms too. This is not a presidential election, right? So normally turnout is down, interest is down, but you think it's there. How much of it is related to Donald Trump?
At this point, I don't think it is. I think it's Trumpism. I think there's a real sense of the whole Republican Party has moved so far out of the realm of decency and common sense, and especially the way the Republican Party's combined a kind of anti-democracy authoritarian bent with a kind of looting kleptocratic bent where it's all about shoveling money from the middle class to those at the top, and that's a really toxic combination. But it means that it's so critical to prevent Republicans from getting control of the Senate. There's obviously a huge fight for the House in Wisconsin itself. Our governor is the one barrier that we have against Republicans shredding voting rights here and even potentially giving themselves the power to overturn a presidential election result. And Wisconsin was the tipping point state in both of the last 2 presidential elections. So it might very well be that whether or not the result in Wisconsin is actually honored determines the next president of the United States. And that kind of crisis of democracy has really energized people. It's not Trump specific. It's about the way that the Republican Party and the insurrection, all those different pieces have just attacked the fundamental American idea that voters decide who leads our country.
Is the governor up for re-election this year?
He is. So Governor Tony Evers was elected by 1.1 percentage points at Wisconsin landslide in 2018. He's up in 2022. We were working very closely with his campaign, and the New York Times described the governorships of Wisconsin, Pennsylvania, Michigan as the seawall for voting rights. If we can win the governor's race, hold on to a Democratic governorship here, then the governor can keep vetoing the voter suppression bills Republicans keep trying to pass. If Republicans get the governorship, it becomes really tough.
Looking at, as you said, Wisconsin politics being so key at the national level in determining which direction the country goes, when you look back at the history of Wisconsin politics, right? I mean, you've got some real, I consider heroes, right, of democracy, Robert La Follette and Gaylord Nelson and Bill Proxmire, Russ Feingold, Tammy Baldwin today, Mark Buchanan. and then you got Joe McCarthy and Ron Johnson. It's sort of like the rest of us don't know what to make of Wisconsin. Right?
You're exactly right. Yeah, there's some places that, they're evenly divided, and so the politicians are middle of the road. In Wisconsin, there really is a fighting progressive champion tradition, and there's a far-right demagogue tradition. And it's like this constant giant showdown between those two forces, between these two fundamentally different ideas about what our country should be, whether it should be ruled through fear or ruled through hope and people uniting to take on corporate power to make things better for everyone. And in that fight, the critical thing is the battle against cynicism. I think that the division in Wisconsin over the last decade made some people tune out. People don't like the fact that they lose friends over battles about, whether they think teachers should be paid a living wage. But we need to keep fixed in people's minds the fact that when we get together, when we all do everything we can win these elections. We've won now 10 of the last 11 statewide races in our state. And even though this is a midterm that's going to be tough, if we turn out in the numbers that I know that we can beat Ron Johnson. We can reelect Governor Tony Evers. We can stop Republican supermajorities in the legislature. We can make a difference that will echo for generations in our state and nationwide.
If you liked what you heard, please get involved in our efforts to keep this show going and to elect Democrats who are bringing the party back to its roots. Go to americasdemocrats.org and click on Donate at the top of the page. And be sure to find 21st Century Democrats on Facebook and Twitter, and leave us a review on your favorite podcast app. We want you to sit back and listen, but we need you to stand up and fight. Join us. Support the americasdemocrats.org podcast, a project of 21st Century Democrats, and help elect Democrats who will stand up for democratic principles with your contribution today. Go to americasdemocrats.org and click on Donate at the top of the page.